In 1978, a young sheriff's deputy set out on what should have been a quiet night patrol in her small town. She never came back. Her radio fell silent, her cruiser vanished, and the community was left haunted by questions no one could answer. For decades, theories swirled. Did she run away? Was she hiding a secret life? Or was someone out there waiting for her in the dark? Police scoured rivers, forests, even abandoned mines. Still nothing. Then more than 2 decades later, the Earth itself gave up its secret. A sudden landslide tore open a hillside, exposing something buried deep beneath the soil. Her missing patrol car. But what investigators found inside that vehicle didn't just solve a mystery. It opened a nightmare. One that would leave an entire town shaken, and a family facing a truth darker than they ever imagined. And the most chilling part, what they uncovered suggests she never even had a chance. So before we dive into this story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you love true crime mysteries, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? It's 1978, a small rural county in the American West. Life is quiet, but not always safe. And standing on the front line is a 26-year-old deputy sheriff. She is young, but she has already built a strong reputation. In town, people know her face. At the diner, the waitress calls her by name. At the gas station, workers smile when she pulls up. Kids wave at her patrol car. She isn't just an officer, she's part of the community. Her family is proud of her. Her parents say she has always been brave, even as a child. She is the kind of person who runs toward trouble, not away from it. That's why she put on the badge. And even though it's dangerous, she believes she can make a difference. On this cool evening in late spring, she eats a quick meal at home, puts on her uniform and clips on her badge. She checks her revolver, her flashlight, and her radio. Then she walks outside to her patrol car. It's routine. She has done this hundreds of times. Nothing feels unusual. The car engine rumbles to life. She pulls out of the driveway, waves goodbye to her neighbor, and heads down the quiet road. This is supposed to be just another shift. A few traffic stops, some paperwork, maybe checking on a noise complaint. But tonight will not end like any other night. Hours later, people will be asking the same chilling question. Where did she go? At 8:45 p.m., her voice comes across the radio. She checks in with dispatch, her tone steady and calm. It's just a normal status update. Unit 12 clear, beginning patrol. Dispatch responds with a quick acknowledgement. Nothing strange. Nothing alarming. She drives along county roads, headlights cutting through the dark. Her car passes empty fields and scattered houses. The radio stays quiet except for the occasional routine call. Around 9:15, she makes one more call to dispatch. She reports a quick check on a parked vehicle. Everything is fine. She sounds relaxed, even cheerful. She doesn't say much else. Just another box ticked on her nightly rounds. It is the last time anyone will ever hear her voice. After that silence, no more radio checks, no calls for backup, no warnings, nothing. Dispatch assumes she is just busy. Officers sometimes forget to check in when things are slow, but as the night stretches on, concern grows. By 11 p.m., the lack of contact feels unusual. By midnight, it feels frightening. Her radio should not be this quiet. She should have called again, but she didn't. And that silence is the first clue that something terrible has happened. At first, no one at the sheriff's office thought much about it. Deputies could get tied up on long calls or stuck helping another officer. But as the clock crept past midnight, something felt off. Her last radio check had been routine, calm, nothing out of the ordinary. But now she wasn't answering dispatch. Calls went out again, silence. Her patrol car computer showed no new activity. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night. Supervisors called her badge number again. Nothing. Officers radioed nearby units to check the highways and back roads, hoping she'd just been busy. But every mile they covered only deepened the worry. By 1 a.m., the unease turned into alarm. A deputy missing from the radio was no small thing. It could mean a crash, a fight, or worse. And in this small community, everyone knew her. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. One officer drove to the usual places she patrolled. Another checked the gas stations and diners where deputies sometimes stopped. Still nothing. As the hours passed, the station grew quiet. Radios clicked on and off, each call answered only by static. The unease spread from person to person. By 2 a.m., the truth hit everyone. Something was wrong. Back at her parents' house, the night dragged on painfully slow. She had told her mother earlier that day she'd swing by after shift, maybe even stay for dinner the next evening. That promise was replaying in her mother's mind now, as the clock ticked past midnight. She was never late without a reason. Never. Her father checked the window every few minutes, half expecting to see headlights pulling into the driveway. Each time the road stayed empty, his chest grew tighter. By 12:30, her younger brother paced the living room, asking if maybe she had gotten called out on something big. Maybe she'd left her radio in the car. But even he didn't believe the excuses he was offering. When 1 a.m. came, the phone rang. Her father jumped to answer. It wasn't her, it was the sheriff's office. They asked if she had called home, if she had stopped by. The silence that followed told the family everything. Her mother's hands shook as she held the receiver, her voice breaking. This isn't like her. Panic set in. Every minute felt like an hour. The house, once calm, now echoed with fear. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, one thought filled the family's mind. She was in danger. By dawn, the search was in full swing. Patrol cars spread out across the county, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Deputies checked every back road she normally drove, pulling over to scan ditches and fence lines for signs of a crash. Nothing. They stopped by diners and gas stations, asking workers if they'd seen her squad car. No one had. Not a single person remembered her stopping by that night. It was like she had been erased from the town. Hospitals were called. Maybe she had been injured and brought in without identification. The answer was the same everywhere. No one matching her had come through the doors. Her patrol car computer gave no clues. No traffic stops, no notes, no warnings logged after her last check-in. The machine was as silent as her radio. By 7 a.m., supervisors expanded the search to county lines. Roadblocks were discussed, but there was no evidence to guide them, no direction to chase. Each passing hour drained hope. A missing deputy wasn't just an officer out of contact. It meant danger. It meant something had gone terribly wrong. The searchers looked more desperate now, scanning every shadow like it held the answer. But no matter how far they pushed, there was nothing. She was gone. By sunrise, word had already spread beyond the sheriff's office. In a small town, news like this traveled fast. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering. Kids overheard adults speaking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of it. Maybe her car broke down, one woman said at the corner store. Another shook her head. She would have called. Everyone knows she would have called. By noon, the mood shifted from concern to fear. Church bells rang for morning service, but inside the pews, people weren't focused on prayers. They were whispering about the deputy. Did someone grab her? One man asked quietly. Others nodded grimly. No one wanted to say it, but the thought was on everyone's mind. The sheriff held back official statements, but that only fueled the rumors. Some swore they'd seen suspicious trucks on the highway that night. Others claimed she had been targeted by someone she'd arrested. By evening, the tension was thick. Parents kept children inside. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Every noise outside felt louder, more threatening. For years, the town had trusted their deputies to keep them safe. Now one of their own had disappeared without a trace. If a trained, respected officer could vanish, what chance did anyone else have? The unease spread through every street, every family. People looked over their shoulders more often. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Something terrible had happened, and everyone knew it. By the second morning, everything had changed. This was no longer about a late deputy or a broken radio. With no trace of her, no sign of her patrol car, and no word from anyone who had seen her, the sheriff's office made it official. She had disappeared. The word missing hit like a shockwave. For deputies, it meant their worst fear. One of their own had vanished while on duty. For the community, it meant something darker was happening in their quiet town. The command post buzzed with tension. Maps were rolled out across tables. Red markers circled every possible route she could have taken that night. Officers traded theories and clipped voices. If it was an accident, we'd have found the wreck by now. Maybe someone followed her, forced her off the road. The sheriff's voice cut through the noise. This is now a full-scale search. Dozens of deputies hit the roads, joined by state police. Helicopters scanned fields and rivers. Search dogs combed the woods, noses pressed to the ground, handlers straining to keep up. But each search ended the same. Nothing. No skid marks. No broken glass. No trace of a uniform or a badge. By mid-afternoon, the pressure exploded into panic. News crews showed up, cameras rolling as they questioned officers. How can a deputy vanish in her own patrol car? Families called the station nonstop, asking if their loved ones were safe. Behind the scenes, deputies quietly admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. This wasn't just a missing person. This was a crime. Fear gripped the town, and the case grew darker by the hour. The morning after her disappearance, the sheriff's office went into crisis mode. Radios crackled with urgent orders. Deputies were pulled from every corner of the county. This was no longer just a search. It was an emergency. Roadblocks were set up on every major highway leading in and out of town. Officers waved cars to the side, peering inside, scanning trunks, asking questions. Drivers were frustrated, but no one argued once they heard why. A deputy was missing and her car had vanished with her. Dispatch phones rang nonstop. Call after call came in, rumors, tips, possible sightings. A patrol car here, a woman in uniform there. Each one was logged, checked, and crossed out. Nothing stuck. The sheriff gave a clear order to his men. Every eye in this county is on the lookout. She is not leaving this place without us knowing. Volunteer groups formed almost immediately. Farmers, shopkeepers, teenagers. They all grabbed flashlights, trucks, and hunting dogs. The town wasn't big, and the deputy was one of their own. People felt like they were searching for family. By nightfall, the entire county was tense. Patrol cars crawled along back roads, shining spotlights into ditches and thickets. The radio buzzed with check-ins every few minutes. But still, the one voice everyone wanted to hear, the missing deputy, never came across. The harder they looked, the stranger it became. How could a car that big just vanish without a single trace? The fear was spreading now. Quiet whispers filled the diners and gas stations. If they can't find her, what does that mean? Everyone was watching, waiting for news. But there was only silence. On the second day, the search moved upward. Helicopters thundered across the skis, their blades chopping the air as they hovered over highways, rivers, and forests. From above, the pilots had a wide view of the land. If the deputy's car had crashed, if it had gone off the road, they would spot it. Searchlights cut through the trees at night. Beams of bright white light swept across fields, rivers, and canyons. Each flash of metal below made hearts race. But every time crews checked, it was nothing. An old tractor, a rusted water tank, just junk. Rivers were scanned carefully. Boats moved slowly under bridges while helicopters hovered overhead. The current was strong in places, but the water was clear enough that a sunken car should have been visible. Still, there was nothing. From the air, the town looked small and fragile. Every road, every bend, every dirt track was mapped and checked. Yet no one saw a single sign of her. Frustration grew inside the command post. The sheriff slammed his fist on the table. Cars don't just disappear. But that's exactly what it felt like. The silence from the skis only made the mystery darker. While helicopters scanned from above, the ground search pushed deeper. Deputies mounted ATVs and tore down old dirt paths, their headlights cutting through the night. Volunteers moved in groups, carrying flashlights that bobbed through the trees like fireflies. The dogs worked hardest. Straining on leashes, noses pressed to the ground, they searched for any trace of her, scent from her uniform, the leather of her belt, even the oil from her car. But the handlers knew quickly. The trail was cold. The dogs pulled left, then right, circling, confused. Neighbors walked shoulder to shoulder, calling her name into the dark woods. Their voices echoed, then faded into silence. The night felt endless, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. Every rustle of branches made searchers freeze. Every shadow looked like it could be something. But each time they pushed forward, they found nothing but trees, mud, and endless emptiness. By dawn, dozens of miles of back roads, fields, and forests had been covered. Yet it was as if she had vanished off the face of the earth. The searchers trudged back, drained and shaken. People exchanged quiet looks but didn't speak their fears out loud. With no answers on the ground, her family turned to the cameras. That week the local news opened with her smiling photo on every screen. She looked young, confident, and proud in her uniform. Underneath, in bold letters, the caption read, "Missing Deputy." Her parents sat under bright studio lights, holding hands tightly. Her mother's voice trembled as she begged anyone with information to come forward. Her father's jaw was tight, his eyes red, but his message was clear. "Please, if you know anything, help us bring her home." The community watched in silence. Phones rang at the sheriff's office as viewers called in tips. A woman thought she saw a patrol car near an abandoned barn. A truck driver swore he passed her on the highway the night she vanished. Deputies rushed to chase every lead, but every call ended the same. Wrong car, wrong person, nothing. The TV pleas kept coming, but each night the hope dimmed a little more. The smiling photo on the screen no longer felt like a sign of hope. It felt like a ghost, staring back at everyone who still had no answers. As days dragged into weeks, the silence became unbearable. With no solid leads, the town filled the void with whispers. Some swore it was criminals. The deputy had arrested dangerous people, and maybe one of them came back for revenge. Quiet voices in diners said, "She knew too much. Someone shut her up." Others thought differently. A few believed she ran away. She was young, only 26. Maybe she wanted out of the uniform, out of the small town, out of everything. But those who knew her best shook their heads. That wasn't her. She wouldn't abandon her family. She wouldn't vanish without a word. And then came the darkest theory. Whispers spread that maybe someone inside the badge betrayed her. Another officer. Someone she trusted. After all, who else could make her car disappear without a trace? Theories swirled everywhere, at gas stations, at kitchen tables, at church pews on Sundays. But none had proof. They were just stories feeding fear. The truth was simple and terrifying. Nobody knew where she was. Investigators refused to stop. They chased every single lead, no matter how thin. A tip about a patrol car spotted in a field sent deputies racing across the county. When they arrived, it was just a farmer's old truck. A call about a uniform found near the river had everyone on edge. Turned out to be an abandoned raincoat. Every supposed clue collapsed into nothing. Detectives rechecked her bank records, no activity. They pulled phone records, nothing unusual. They interviewed coworkers, friends, and even people she had arrested. No one had answers. The case file grew thicker by the week. Reports stacked high on the sheriff's desk. Each page told the same story. No car, no body, no trace. The pressure was brutal. Reporters wanted updates. The family begged for progress. The sheriff snapped at his deputies, demanding they find something, anything. But there was nothing left to find. By the end of the year, the search that had once consumed the county slowed to a crawl. Roadblocks disappeared. The helicopters were grounded. Volunteers stopped showing up. What remained was silence, heavy and final. The deputy's photo still hung on the sheriff's wall, smiling in uniform, but the hope that she'd be found alive was gone. The case wasn't just unsolved. It was vanishing just like she had. Weeks passed, then months. The search teams grew smaller until they were gone completely. The helicopters stopped flying, the roadblocks came down, and the dogs were sent back to their kennels. At first, people asked questions everywhere, at the diner, at the post office, at church on Sundays. Any news? Did they find her? But each time the answer was the same. No, nothing, she was still missing. Slowly the questions stopped. It wasn't that people forgot. It was that they were tired of asking, tired of hearing the same hollow answer. The silence grew heavier than the words ever could. The town changed. The missing deputy was always there, even when no one spoke about her. She lingered like a shadow. Parents started warning their kids more than before. Don't stay out too late. Don't walk alone at night. Always tell us where you're going. Kids didn't understand the full story, but they knew something terrible had happened, something no one wanted to explain in detail. The sheriff's office was different, too. Her empty desk remained untouched, her name still on the roster. Deputies tried to move on with daily calls and reports, but every time the radio crackled with static, there was a brief, unspoken pause. As if maybe, just maybe, her voice would break through after all this time. But it never did. Her family carried the weight hardest. Holidays came and went with her chair left empty at the table. Her mother refused to move her belongings from her room. The uniform she last wore was still pressed and hanging in the closet. Her father grew quieter, his words few, his shoulders bent with grief. Some townspeople clung to small theories to cope. Maybe she had run away to start a new life, far from here. Maybe she was undercover, working a secret case no one was allowed to talk about. Others clung to the opposite belief, that she had been taken, and that someone in town knew more than they were saying. Either way, no proof ever surfaced. By the end of the year, the case had gone cold. Newspapers stopped printing her photo on the front page. The nightly news stopped running updates. But in the quiet moments when the streets were empty and the air was still, everyone felt it. A hole in the heart of the town, a scar that time wasn't healing. Life continued, but not the same. There was always the sense that something terrible had entered their world in 1978 and had never really left. The young deputy was gone, and the silence she left behind was the loudest thing of all. By the early 1980s, her case had stopped making headlines. The search parties were long gone, and the deputies who once worked every lead had been reassigned to other duties. But in town, her name never disappeared. She was no longer just a deputy who had gone missing. She had become something bigger, a story, a warning, a legend. Parents told their kids not to walk home alone after dark. "Remember what happened to her," they would whisper. "Don't let it happen to you." Her photo still hung on the wall at the sheriff's office. New recruits would stop and stare at it, asking questions. The older deputies would shake their heads. They didn't have answers. They would only say, "She vanished. That's all we know." Teenagers traded rumors late at night. Some said she was buried in the woods by criminals she once arrested. Others claimed she had run away and was living under another name. There were even wild stories that she was working for the FBI, hiding somewhere undercover. But none of it was true. No one really knew. The years dragged on, and her name became like a ghost in conversations. Not spoken every day, but always there, just below the surface. She had gone from being a bright, young deputy with a future to becoming the most haunting mystery the town had ever faced. And deep down, everyone quietly believed they might never know the truth. Her family carried the weight of her disappearance every single day. At the dinner table, her chair was always left empty. Holidays became painful reminders of her absence. Birthdays were the worst. Her parents would bring out her favorite cake, light the candles, and then sit in silence. Her mother refused to move her things. Her room was kept just as she had left it in 1978. The bed was neatly made, her uniform pressed and hanging in the closet, her shoes lined up by the door. To her mother, changing anything meant admitting she was never coming home. Her father handled it differently. He grew quieter, rarely speaking about her. But when he thought no one was looking, he would sit in the living room and hold her photo in his hands, staring at it for long stretches of time. Her siblings, if asked, would always say the same thing: "We just want answers." The family never stopped hopping, but as the years stretched on with no news, that hope slowly turned into something heavier. Not belief, not closure, just waiting. Endless waiting. Years pass and then, suddenly, rumors surface. Someone swears they saw her in a diner 2 states away. Another caller claims she was spotted getting into a truck near the border. Letters arrive, some anonymous, some signed, all promising they know what happened. Detectives chase each lead with fresh energy. They make calls, drive across state lines, and dig into strangers' stories. For a moment, the silence of the case breaks. For a moment, it feels alive again. Then one by one, each lead collapses. The woman in the diner, just a local waitress who looked similar. The truck sighting, a mix-up confused by poor lighting. The letters, hoaxes, some cruel, some desperate for attention. And then came the drifter. He told officers he knew everything, that he had been there, that he watched her vanish. Detectives leaned in, desperate for something, anything. But the drifter's story crumbled under questions. He wanted money, food, or simply someone to listen. Each false lead left investigators exhausted. Each dead end crushed the family, who clung to hope every time the phone rang. Every rumor carried a heartbeat of belief, only to end in heartbreak. Hope sparked, flickered, and died. Again and again. The trail remained empty. Inside the sheriff's office, the years changed faces. Young recruits came in, old deputies retired. But her story never left the walls. In the back row of lockers, her photo stayed taped to the metal. A smiling face in uniform, frozen in time. Some deputies touched the picture before heading out on patrol. Others kept quiet, but their eyes lingered. At roll calls, her name wasn't spoken, but her absence hung in the air. Every missing person call, every abandoned car, they thought of her. For new deputies, she became a warning. The story was passed down like a lesson. This job can take you. This can happen. For veterans, it was personal. They remembered her laugh, the way she handled calls, the promise of her career. They remembered the night she didn't come back. Years later, some still drove by the spot where she was last seen. They slowed their cars, eyes scanning the same stretch of road, knowing they wouldn't find anything, but unable to stop looking. The case file sat deep in storage, dust on the box, pages fatting. But the people who wore the badge carried her memory. They didn't talk about it often, but in the quiet moments, in locker rooms, in squad cars, in late-night shifts, they remembered. To the world, she was a story that had gone cold. To them, she was still a partner who never came home. By the early 1990s, her case file had grown massive. Inside the sheriff's office, the box was heavy with reports. Hundreds of pages, tips scribbled on notepads, Polaroids, maps with red circles, transcripts of interviews with neighbors, coworkers, even strangers from faraway towns. But none of it brought answers. Every time a tip came in, investigators filed it. When a call arrived, another report was written. If someone claimed to know something, it was recorded. Over the years, the file turned into a mountain of paper. Detectives flipped through it again and again, trying to see what they missed. They hoped some detail would suddenly connect, but it never did. The file was not a record of progress. It was a record of failure. Pages stacked on top of each other like layers of disappointment. The thicker the file became, the clearer the truth was. The answers weren't there. For her family, that box represented lost years. For investigators, it became a weight they carried every day. And yet, nobody could stop adding to it, because even without hope, the case was still alive on paper. Alive but unsolved. Her disappearance didn't just scar her family or fellow deputies. It scarred the entire town. By the 1990s, people spoke of it like a curse. They whispered in diners, in church pews, in school hallways. Everyone had a theory, but nobody had peace. Parents warned their kids not to walk alone. Teenagers joked nervously about the ghost deputy who still haunted the back roads. Truckers refused to stop on the stretch of highway where she vanished. Shops closed earlier. The streets emptied quicker at night. The disappearance left a shadow. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dark to happen again. Visitors passing through could sense it. They asked, "Why is everyone so tense?" Locals would only shake their heads. They didn't want to talk about it, but the truth was simple. When someone could vanish without a trace, nobody felt safe. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was part of the town's identity, a story carried like a scar. For years, kids grew up hearing about the deputy who never came home, and as they grew older, they carried the same unease their parents had felt. The mystery didn't fade with time. If anything, it deepened. The town lived in the shadow of her absence, and that shadow touched everyone. By the late 1990s, the town had stopped waiting. At first, people still believed she would be found. In the early years, every phone call, every knock on the door, every news update carried a pulse of hope. But as time stretched into a decade, hope slowly drained away. The missing deputy was no longer a daily topic. Her name wasn't in the paper anymore. The news stations had moved on. What remained was a quiet, heavy truth. Most people now believed the answers would never come. Her case had shifted. It was no longer just a police file, no longer an active search. It had become something different, something closer to a legend. Kids in town grew up hearing about her the way others heard about ghost stories. At sleepovers, they whispered about the night she vanished. They dared each other to walk the dark road where she was last seen. Some swore they saw her figure in the trees. Others claimed they heard her voice on the wind. None of it was real, but the story carried power. Her family carried the heaviest weight of all. Holidays passed with one seat always empty. Every birthday cake felt incomplete. They tried to live, but the wound never healed. Friends stopped asking after a while, unsure what else to say. The silence around the subject became its own kind of pain. Inside the sheriff's office, her file still sat on a shelf. Deputies who had once worked the case had retired or moved on. Younger officers knew her story only as a warning, proof that sometimes, no matter how hard you look, people can simply vanish. The thick case file was pulled down less and less, its pages yellowing with age. The community, too, shifted into a quiet acceptance. It wasn't that they didn't care anymore, it was that caring hurt too much. Talking about her, hopping for her, wishing for answers, it only brought the pain back to the surface. So they stopped. By the late 1990s, her disappearance was no longer treated like an open wound. It was spoken of in hushed tones, almost like folklore, something dark that happened long ago, something that could never be explained. But even in that quiet acceptance, fear lingered. If it could happen to her, a trained deputy, someone strong, someone who knew the roads better than anyone, then it could happen to anyone. That thought never went away. And so the truth became this. The deputy's story was no longer a mystery to solve. It had become a myth, a shadow that lived in the background of the town's identity. People moved forward, but the space she left behind remained. No answers, no justice, no peace. Just silence. By the early 2000s, her case was little more than a memory. Then, in the spring of 2004, the weather turned violent. For weeks, rain pounded the county. Streams overflowed, fields turned into lakes, and roads washed out under the pressure. Locals stayed inside, hoping the storms would pass, but the water kept coming. The ground itself couldn't hold. Hillsides softened. Trees leaned at dangerous angles. On one night, after days of soaking rain, the pressure built too high. A hillside near the edge of town finally gave way. It started with cracks in the soil. Then, with a deep groan, the land broke loose. Tons of mud, rocks, and trees thundered down the slope. The roar could be heard miles away. The landslide ripped across the old logging road, swallowing everything in its path. Fences crumbled. Power lines snapped. The road disappeared under a wave of dirt and stone. By the time the slide ended, the hillside looked completely different. Where there had once been thick brush, there was now a scar of raw earth. For most people, it was just another disaster, another mark of the storm's damage. But buried in that chaos, hidden for decades, the land had finally given up its secret. The next morning, locals came out to survey the damage. The road was gone, buried under mud and broken trees. Crews moved in with bulldozers to start clearing the path. That's when someone noticed it. In the churned dirt and shattered brush, a sharp glint of metal poked through the mud. At first, people thought it was scrap, maybe a piece of fencing or farm equipment. But as the machines scraped closer, more of it appeared. The shape didn't look random. It looked like a roof. Workers paused, staring at the jagged outline of something long hidden. Slowly, they began to dig around it. Inch by inch, the mud peeled back. What had once been dismissed as scrap now revealed itself to be something far more chilling. It was the rusted frame of a vehicle. For decades, the town had wondered where she had gone. Now, buried deep in the hillside, the earth itself was giving them an answer. But no one was prepared for what they would find once they looked inside. As crews worked, curious residents gathered along the edges of the slide. From a distance, the metal sticking out of the dirt didn't look like much. But the closer they came, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a chunk of debris. Someone pointed to the top, where a rounded bar jutted out from the mud. It looked like a roof light, the kind only seen on patrol cars. A few feet lower, A thin strip of chrome hinted at the edge of a door. The lines were too exact, too familiar. Whispers spread through the crowd. Could this really be a car? The more they looked, the more obvious it became. This wasn't farm scrap or a piece of machinery. Buried beneath the earth was the outline of a whole vehicle, crushed and rusted by decades underground. People exchanged uneasy glances. In this town, there was only one missing car that had haunted them for years, and the thought of it suddenly appearing from under a hillside left them shaken. The strange shape in the mud wasn't random. It was history breaking through the earth. The sheriff's office was called immediately. Within an hour, deputies and state police arrived at the landslide site. The crowd stepped back as the uniforms pushed forward, flashlights in hand. One deputy reached out with a gloved hand and wiped away a layer of mud. The dull outline of a star emblem shone through the rust. Another cleared the side and uncovered the faint remains of numbers once painted on the door. It was no ordinary car. It was a police cruiser. The deputies froze. Everyone knew what that meant. There had only been one patrol car that vanished from this county decades ago. The missing deputy, the young woman who disappeared on patrol, had driven this exact model. Word spread like fire. People whispered, gasped, some even cried. The impossible had just become real. For 26 years, her name had been spoken like a ghost story. And now, against all odds, her car had surfaced from the earth itself. The discovery confirmed what many feared and others doubted. She had never left. She had been here the whole time. By morning, the news was everywhere. Radio stations reported it, TV crews rushed in, and phones rang nonstop. The long-lost patrol car had been found. Crowds formed along the edges of the blocked road. People who had been children back in 1978 now brought their own kids to see it. They pointed at the muddy roof light and explained, "This is the story we grew up with." Some stood silently, hands over their mouths, unable to believe it. Others cried. For years, the deputy's disappearance had been an open wound. Now it felt like the wound had been ripped open again. But this time, there was something to actually look at. Old-timers shook their heads, saying they had always believed the truth would come out somehow. Younger people, who had only heard the legend, stood in awe. The sight of that rusted cruiser made the mystery real again. The story wasn't just a ghost tale told at night. It was right there, in front of them, breaking through the mud and stone. For investigators, this was the moment they thought would never come. After 26 years of silence, there was finally something solid to hold on to. They marked off the site, treating it like a crime scene. Every inch of mud around the vehicle was searched. Photos were taken, measurements recorded. What mattered most was not just that the car was found, it was where it was found. The old logging road above the hillside had been closed for years. Few people even remembered it was there. But now, it told investigators a story. The deputy had been driving this stretch of road the night she vanished. Something had caused her car to leave the path and disappear into the earth. For the first time in decades, detectives had direction. They had the vehicle, the location, and possibly evidence still preserved inside. Families who had begged for answers finally had reason to hope. Officers who had carried her photo in their lockers felt the spark of duty again. The silence that had haunted the case for so long was broken. The truth had been buried for over 2 decades, but now the ground had given it back. The hillside was cleared, the mud shoveled away, and heavy machinery rolled in. The crowd grew silent as the first cables were hooked to the rusted frame of the patrol car. This wasn't just a recovery, it was history being pulled from the ground. Engines roared, and slowly the mud-caked vehicle began to rise. Chunks of dirt and rock fell away, clattering against the slope. The shape of the cruiser became clearer with every inch it lifted. The light bar sagged, windows shattered, paint nearly eaten away by years underground. Onlookers didn't move. They held their breath as the car was dragged upward, one careful tug at a time. Deputies, who had once been young rookies when she vanished, now stood as gray-haired men watching her car emerge after decades of silence. When the vehicle finally rolled onto stable ground, covered in thick mud and scars from time, the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just metal and rubber. This was the missing deputy's final place. For the first time since 1978, her patrol car had returned to daylight. Once the car was on solid ground, investigators moved in. They worked carefully, knowing the contents could hold the answers everyone had waited decades to hear. A crowbar wedged into the rusted door. It groaned, resisted, then finally gave way with a sharp crack. The moment it opened, a wave of stale, sick air spilled out, a smell trapped for over 2 decades. People nearby turned their heads. Flashlights shone into the darkness inside. At first, there was only broken glass, mud, and torn fabric. But then came the details no one wanted to see. A faded uniform sleeve still clung to the steering wheel. A badge, dull but recognizable, lay against the seat. And then the truth no one could deny. Bones. Human remains strapped in place by the seat belt, still locked after all those years. The missing deputy had never left. She had been inside her patrol car the entire time, hidden by the hillside, waiting to be found. The remains were carefully removed and sent to the state lab. Days later, the results came back. Forensics confirmed what the family had both dreaded and longed to hear. It was her. The missing deputy had finally been found. For 26 years, they had lived in uncertainty. Some believed she was alive somewhere. Others feared she had been murdered. Now the truth was clear. She had never left. She had been in that car, beneath that hillside, from the very beginning. When the family was told, grief hit them like it was day one all over again. Tears came, hugs followed, and silence filled the room. But with the pain came a small piece of peace. At least they finally knew. The community gathered for a memorial. Photos of the young deputy in uniform were placed on display. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed. Bells rang as her name was spoken once more, not as a mystery, but as a life remembered. The search was over. The deputy who vanished in 1978 was no longer missing. She was home. Even with answers, questions immediately surfaced. Investigators studied the car closely. The hillside explained why it had been hidden, but not how it got there. The road above was narrow, dangerous, and dark at night. It was possible she had misjudged a turn, lost control, and gone over the edge. A tragic accident buried by time. But detectives noticed details that didn't fit. The damage to the cruiser seemed unusual. The angle of the skid marks suggested speed, or maybe a push. And her injuries, though hard to fully read after so many years, hinted at a struggle before the crash. The debate grew. Was this a freak accident made worse by nature? Or had the deputy been forced off the road, silenced by someone who wanted her gone? The town, once quiet in its grief, now buzzed with new theories. What really happened that night in 1978? As forensic teams sifted through the wreckage, more unsettling details came to light. The cruiser wasn't just buried by time. It carried evidence of something darker. Inside the cabin, shards of glass were scattered in ways that didn't make sense for a simple crash. Several windows had shattered inward, as if struck from outside. Investigators also noted scuff marks on the dashboard and door panels, like someone had been shoved or kicked. The remains told their own story too. Experts studying the deputy's bones noticed signs of bruising and fractures that likely happened before the crash, not during it. Small details, the kind only specialists would see, hinted that she may have fought back against someone in her final moments. The damage to the vehicle itself raised even more doubts. One side panel bore deep dents, not from hitting trees during the fall, but from an impact that looked deliberate. It was the kind of damage a larger vehicle, like a truck, might cause if it forced the car off the road. These findings painted a chilling picture. This wasn't just a young deputy losing control on a dark night. The evidence suggested she wasn't alone in those final moments. She had been attacked, she had resisted, and her car had been sent over the edge by force. To understand what really happened, investigators turned to the land itself. The old logging road above the slide was carefully mapped and studied. Experts walked the slope, measuring angles, studying broken branches, and photographing every mark. What they found was clear. This wasn't a simple skid or slide. At the top of the road, faint tire marks still scarred the ground, preserved under layers of dirt. They didn't match a slow drift. They were deep, sharp, and angled, consistent with a car being pushed at speed. Further down the slope, broken branches showed a straight, violent path of descent. The car hadn't rolled lazily off the road. It had been forced over, plunging forward with momentum, smashing through trees before the hillside buried it. The terrain itself became evidence. The angle of descent, the trail of destruction, and the damage to the car all told the same story. The deputy's cruiser hadn't simply slipped into the dark. It had been driven off, fast and hard. This finding was critical. For the first time, investigators had physical proof that supported what many had suspected all along. The deputy's death was not an accident. It was foul play. When the experts laid out their findings, the room fell into a heavy silence. For years, people had clung to the idea that the young deputy's death was a tragic accident, a night of fatigue, a simple miscalculation, a lonely road. But the evidence said something else. And once the door to that possibility opened, no one could close it again. The shattered glass, the dents that didn't match the crash, the fractures on her bones, all of it whispered the same truth. She hadn't been alone. She hadn't simply lost control. Something had happened before her car left that road. Something violent. Whispers spread through the community. Maybe she had been chased. Locals remembered the stories of strange cars tailing officers on remote highways back then. Maybe one of those cars had boxed her in, bumping her until she veered toward the edge. Or maybe it had been an ambush. Some believed she might have stopped to check on something, or someone on the side of the road. If she'd stepped out of her cruiser even briefly, she could have been attacked and forced back inside. The bruises, the scuff marks, the smashed windows, they all supported the theory that she fought back, desperately trying to escape her attacker's grip. And then there was the third, darker possibility. Maybe her killer had been inside the car with her all along. That thought sent a chill through the investigative team. It would explain the struggle inside the cabin, the way the glass had shattered inward, the strange angle of certain injuries. It would also explain the speed and violence of the plunge down the slope if someone else had taken the wheel. The more investigators played out the scenarios, the more disturbing they became. No version pointed to an accident. Every version pointed to intent. For her family, the revelation was both devastating and strangely relieving. After years of uncertainty, they finally had clarity. She had not simply driven off the road and vanished. She had fought for her life. She had been forced into that final, violent descent. But this clarity also brought new fear. If she had been attacked, then by whom? A stranger, a criminal she had crossed paths with in her work, or, most unsettling of all, someone within her own circle, perhaps even another officer. The questions multiplied. Investigators began combing through old case files, looking for enemies she might have made. Every arrest she had ever carried out was reconsidered. Every traffic stop, every citation, every confrontation. Did someone have a reason to silence her? And yet, the longer they looked, the less it felt like random revenge. This didn't look like the work of someone lashing out in anger. It looked planned. It looked personal. One detective, flipping through photographs of the crash site, murmured a thought that everyone else had been too cautious to voice. This feels like someone wanted her gone. Someone who knew how to make it look like an accident. Someone who thought burying the car would erase her forever. The disturbing possibility hung over the case like a shadow. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, it was no longer a question of what happened. It was now a question of who made it happen. And if that person was still out there, what else had they done to keep their secret safe? The deputy's disappearance was no longer just a tragic mystery. It was officially a suspected homicide. When investigators studied the patrol car, they noticed things that didn't fit. On the driver's side, the door panel was crushed in with a sharp dent, like something had slammed against it. Along the rear bumper, there were long scrape marks, metal grinding against metal. These weren't the kind of marks you'd see if a car just slipped down a slope. They looked like signs of impact, like another vehicle had rammed into her cruiser before it went over. The experts explained that if the deputy had lost control, the car would have rolled in a smoother pattern, showing damage mostly to the front or underside. But here, the sides told the story. The dents suggested she hadn't been alone on that dark road. Someone else was there, Witnesses from back then had mentioned seeing headlights chasing a car, but no one could prove it. Now, looking at the cruiser, that old rumor didn't sound so crazy. It looked like she might have been forced into that deadly drop. For the family, this detail was shattering. All those years believing it might have been an accident, gone in an instant. The evidence now pointed to something far darker. Someone had attacked her. The car wasn't the only thing raising suspicion. When forensic teams examined her bones, they found injuries that didn't fully match a car crash. Her ribs were broken, but in patterns that looked more like blunt force trauma, like strikes before the fall. Her forearm bones showed signs of defensive wounds, the kind you'd get if you raised your arms to block blows. There was also damage to her skull, but the angle seemed strange. Instead of coming from the roof collapsing in the crash, it looked like an impact made before she went over the edge. These details were small, but to trained eyes, they stood out. The conclusion grew clearer. The deputy may have fought for her life. She hadn't just been a passenger in a tragic accident. She had been attacked. The shattered glass inside the car supported this too. Some pieces were pushed inward, not outward, as if the window had been broken during a struggle. Each piece of evidence made the picture sharper and more chilling. What had once been written off as a mystery accident was beginning to look like murder. Someone had made sure she never came home. Investigators decided to go back to the beginning. They tracked down people who had been around in 1978. Hopping time might loosen memories. Some were hesitant, saying too many years had passed, but others shared things they had kept quiet. One man remembered driving the same stretch of road that night. He swore he saw a pickup truck following close behind the deputy's cruiser. He didn't think much of it then, but now, after hearing about the car's discovery, it haunted him. He described the truck as dark-colored, maybe blue or black. Another person, a retired clerk from the sheriff's office, recalled a strange atmosphere at the station around that time. She remembered whispers, tension, and officers not wanting to talk about the missing deputy. At the time, she assumed it was just the stress of losing one of their own, but now she wondered if there was more to it. The investigators wrote it all down carefully. None of it was solid proof, but when added to the new physical evidence, the story started to shift. This wasn't just a tragic accident hidden by nature. There were hints of pursuit, of conflict, of something darker happening in the hours before she vanished. As the investigation deepened, the spotlight turned somewhere no one wanted it to go. Back inside the department itself, old rumors were dug up, stories about the deputy not getting along with a few of her fellow officers. One rumor stood out. The night before she disappeared, she had been overheard arguing with another deputy. Some described it as heated, others as explosive. The idea that one of their own could be involved shook the town. People had trusted these officers with their lives. But now, whispers spread that the missing deputy's death might not have come from strangers on the road, but from someone she worked beside every day. Investigators interviewed surviving officers from that time. Some grew defensive, others claimed not to remember. A few admitted there had been tension but dismissed it as workplace stress. Nothing was certain, but the suspicion lingered. For the deputy's family, this was the hardest rumor to face. To think that betrayal may have come from within the badge, from people she considered brothers and sisters, was almost too much to bear. Yet the evidence forced the question into the open. With the new discoveries, the quiet town erupted again. For years, people had mostly avoided talking about the missing deputy. Now, everyone had an opinion and no one agreed. Some locals believed the truth was simple. Criminals had taken revenge. The deputy had made arrests, and maybe one of those she locked up wanted payback. They imagined a dark chase through back roads, a pickup truck pushing her off the slope. But others weren't convinced. They whispered about betrayal inside the department. The story of her argument with another officer spread like wildfire. In diners, gas stations, and churches, people debated whether someone in uniform could have forced her car off the road. The divide cut deep. Families argued at dinner tables. Friends who had known each other for decades found themselves on opposite sides. For some, blaming criminals was easier. It kept the idea of trust in the badge alive. For others, the thought of betrayal from within explained the silence, the secrets, and the decades of no answers. Fear began to creep back. Parents warned their children not to trust anyone. Old wounds reopened. The town that had tried to move on was once again caught in anger and suspicion. The story didn't stay local for long. Once word spread that the missing deputy's cruiser had been found, news crews poured into the small county. Cameras lined the streets. Reporters crowded outside the sheriff's office. Headlines screamed across the country, "Murder in uniform," and "Deputy's ghost car found after 26 years." TV anchors spoke in hushed tones, replaying the same images: the mud-covered car being pulled from the hillside, the badge found inside, the bones strapped to the seat. For the town, it was overwhelming. Strangers with microphones knocked on doors. Families who had lived quietly for decades were suddenly on national television. Everyone wanted to know, was it revenge, betrayal, or something else entirely? The deputy's family was forced back into the spotlight. They gave interviews, their voices shaking as they described years of waiting, hopping, and now finally facing the truth. The nation watched, but the answers still weren't there. For investigators, the pressure doubled. Every move they made was dissected by the press. Theories filled newspapers and talk shows. Some said the case was about small-town corruption. Others claimed it was the work of outlaws who hated law enforcement. After decades of silence, the case wasn't just alive again. It was burning under the harsh glare of national attention. After weeks of testing and review, the evidence could no longer be ignored. The dents on the cruiser weren't random. The tire marks on the slope weren't natural. The injuries on her bones weren't from a simple crash. Piece by piece, the picture became clear. This was not an accident. Investigators stood before the cameras and made the announcement. For over 2 decades, people had wondered if the young deputy had simply lost control of her car. Now, that theory was gone forever. She had been forced off the road. The word murder landed like a hammer. For her family, it was painful validation. They had always believed something dark had happened, but hearing it confirmed was both crushing and relieving. They finally knew she hadn't just driven off the road alone that night. For the town, the news was explosive. Fear turned into outrage. Whoever was behind it had gotten away with killing a deputy for 26 years. Neighbors asked hard questions. Was it a criminal with a grudge? Was it someone she worked with? Why hadn't the truth been found sooner? The case was no longer a mystery of what happened. It was now a hunt for a killer, one who might never face justice. Investigators sat down with boxes of evidence, maps, and new forensic reports. Their goal was simple: rebuild the deputy's final drive on that night in 1978. They marked her last confirmed radio call, then traced the roads she likely traveled. Using old patrol logs, they mapped out where she was supposed to be checking. Deputies who had worked with her back then remembered her routine. She always stuck to her route. The team overlaid this with the site where her cruiser was found, buried deep under the hillside. The spot didn't line up with a normal patrol check. To get there, she would have had to take a side road. Why would she go there unless someone was following her or blocking her way? Witness interviews from that night were pulled again. Several locals had mentioned headlights speeding through the area. One recalled the sound of an engine revving hard, like 2 vehicles chasing. At the time, nothing could be confirmed. But now, paired with the crash site, it fit. Step by step, investigators built a timeline. She wasn't lost. She wasn't careless. Something drove her down that road and forced her off it. As they reviewed arrest records from that year, one name stood out: a man known in the county for violence, drinking, and a deep hatred of police. Earlier in 1978, the young deputy had arrested him on assault charges after a bar fight turned ugly. Witnesses said he never forgave her. He told friends he'd get even with the badge who embarrassed him. At the time, no one took the threat seriously. He was just another drunk with a big mouth. But in hindsight, it sounded like a promise. The man drove a pickup truck, similar to the one a witness had described tailing the deputy that night. Records confirmed he was living only a few miles from the area of the crash. He had the motive, the vehicle, and the anger. By the time investigators returned to his name decades later, he was already dead. But his history, his threats, and the witness accounts painted him as the most likely suspect. For the first time, investigators had a face to put to the crime, a man who hated her enough to chase her down. The deeper investigators dug, the more the pieces lined up. Records showed the suspect owned a dark pickup truck in 1978. It was the same make and color described by a man who swore he saw a truck following the deputy's cruiser that night. Back then, his story hadn't been enough to move the case forward. Without a car, without a body, it was just talk. But now, with the patrol car uncovered, investigators could place the sighting near the crash site. The details suddenly mattered. Neighbors remembered seeing that same pickup parked outside bars and gas stations during the late 70s. The man was known for fights, for drinking too much, and for flying into rages when he felt disrespected. Everyone knew he had it out for the deputy after she arrested him. Investigators matched registration papers, old DMV photos, and maintenance records. Everything confirmed he was driving that pickup during the year she disappeared. Witness accounts finally had hard evidence to stand on. Even though decades had passed, the truck became the shadow that haunted the case. The description was too specific, the history too damning. It was the missing piece that tied the man to the deputy's final moments on the road. With the truck confirmed, investigators built a chilling picture of what likely happened. The deputy was driving her routine patrol when headlights appeared in her mirror. The pickup began tailing her, close enough to intimidate. She may have radioed in if she thought it was random, but no call came. That suggested she knew who was behind her, or that the attack happened fast. Forensic analysis of the cruiser revealed dents and scrapes on the rear bumper. They weren't from sliding downhill. They looked like impact, like another vehicle slamming into her. Experts reconstructed the slope where her car was buried. Tire marks showed she tried to steer away, but the truck kept pressing. Branches and rocks along the descent showed the cruiser went down fast, not slow. It wasn't an accident. The theory was grim. The suspect chased her off the road, struck her vehicle, and forced her down the embankment. Before she could reach her radio, before she could fight back, it was over. The crash site was no longer a mystery. It was a trap, and in 1978 she had walked right into it. Investigators were confident they had their man. The truck, the motive, the threats, everything pointed to him. But when they checked court and prison records, they hit a wall. The suspect had died years earlier. He passed away in the late 1980s, only a decade after the deputy vanished. No trial, no cross-examination, no confession. Whatever secrets he carried about that night went to the grave with him. For detectives, it was frustrating. They had worked so long chasing shadows, and when the truth finally surfaced, the suspect was gone. There would be no handcuffs, no sentencing, no moment of justice inside a courtroom. For the family, it was even harder. They finally knew who was responsible, but they would never see him answer for it. He lived out his final years free, while their daughter, sister, and friend had been buried under mud and silence. The case was solved, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt unfinished. When investigators told the family the full story, emotions poured out. After 26 years of waiting, they finally had an answer. The deputy hadn't run away. She hadn't simply vanished. She was murdered and her car buried by the earth. The confirmation brought relief. At last they knew what happened, but the relief was mixed with sorrow. The suspect was dead. There would be no day in court, no chance to look him in the eye. Justice had slipped away with time. Still, the family clung to the truth as a gift. After decades of wondering, they no longer had to imagine endless possibilities. They could finally lay her to rest with certainty. At the memorial service, townspeople gathered again. Some were children in 1978, now grown with kids of their own. They placed flowers by her name and thanked her for her service. The family wept, but they also stood taller. The mystery was over. She was home. In the months after the truth came out, the community rallied. Vigils were held in the town square. People carried candles, whispered prayers, and remembered the young deputy who had once driven their roads to keep them safe. The sheriff's office organized a memorial service. Officers stood in uniform, saluting as her name was read aloud. A bronze plaque was placed at the courthouse, engraved with her badge number and the words, "Gone but not forgotten." Her family unveiled a statue built in her honor. It showed her standing tall in uniform, radio on her shoulder, eyes forward. For the first time since 1978, her story had a proper ending, not hidden in silence but written into history. Schools began teaching her case in local history lessons. Young recruits at the police academy were told her story as a reminder of what service can cost. Her disappearance, once a dark legend, was now framed as an act of courage, a life stolen but never erased. Her name became more than a mystery. It became a symbol of sacrifice, duty, and the dangers faced by those who serve. Even with the truth uncovered, the scars remained. For 26 years, the town had lived in fear, carrying unanswered questions. Those wounds didn't vanish overnight, but closure brought change. Instead of whispering about her disappearance, people now spoke openly about her life. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, her strength. The silence was gone. The case that once divided neighbors now united them. Vigils turned into community gatherings. Strangers embraced her family, promising her name would never fade again. At the annual memorial, children placed flowers by the statue. Their parents told them, "She kept us safe." The deputy's story was no longer about loss, it was about honor. For the first time in decades, the town felt at peace. Her name, carved in stone, would never be forgotten.